thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Daniel and Gregor. Time is short and precious, so let's kick off. Index selection is not new, right? And specifically, the desired gains index, you might have heard of it, has been around for more than 50 years. So why even bother talking about it? Well, we think it is a very powerful tool which provides breeders with a really simple approach to multi-trait selection, so it's at least worth noting it, worth knowing it. And also there have been some very persistent misconceptions around the desired gains index, which I think gave it a little bit of a bad reputation over the last couple of years. So my colleague Daniel here and I set up to cut through those misconceptions, clean them up a bit, and give this index the intention that we believe it deserves. And this is what I'll talk about in the next couple of minutes. So let's start with the basics. What is an index? In a nutshell, very simple. It's just a function that combines different traits or different trait measurements into a single value. These single values are weighted by their importance. Now, this approach allows us to rank genotypes by their overall value, for example, a value as a parent. And with this in mind and our breeding objective, we get what we know from the literature as the most efficient method to multi-trait selection. However, to make use of it, we need to answer two questions. One of them is which measurements should we use? And the second, probably more important one, how do we define importance? Now, the first one to address this question was a plant breeder, Fairfield Smith, already in 1936, almost 100 years ago, and he proposed that we measure the genotypic worth of a parent as a linear function of its genetic values, or genotypic values, weighted by their economic value, their economic weight. And this economic weight, economic value, can be defined as the expected monetary return from a one-unit change in a trait with all other traits held constant. Keep this in mind, please. Obviously, this, what is called the aggregate genotype or aggregate net merit, or a couple of different relatively similar terms, is a very theoretical concept. We don't know true breeding values. We don't know true genetic values. We collect phenotypes and we predict them. And in the same way, we need to predict this aggregate genotype. And Smith and later Hazel and Lush, two animal breeders, showed that if we have phenotypes, this is best achieved if we calculate our index coefficient B as A transpose G P inverse. So what's happening here? Well, A transpose A are our economic weights. G over P, that might sound familiar, is basically a heritability. It's a multi-trait heritability. We have our phenotypes here, and what the index does is it basically gives you a multivariate blub and then weights these blobs by their economic weight. And Henderson later showed that you can use these blobs just directly with the economic weights, which obviously has a couple of advantages and is what we would do today. Now, selection on this index, which became known as the Smith-Hazel index, maximizes response to selection in the aggregate genotypes, which means it is maximizing economic merit. And because of the index doing this, it is often referred to as the optimal index. Now, this is a very great concept, but there's a little bit of a catch here. It is pretty difficult to obtain accurate economic weights. And especially in public plant breeding programs like I'm working with in the CGIAR, this process can be very costly, very labor intensive, very time intensive, and not really manageable, to be honest. So Pacek and Baker already also quite a while ago in 1969 recognized that, as I say, few breeders are prepared to assign relative economic weights to traits, but most would be willing to specify the amount of gain they would like to see in each trait. Now, what is this amount of gain we would like to see? Pretty simple. We can measure our genetic value in the population as it is today, and breeders are usually able to tell you where they want to go with a certain trait in the future. And this is just summarized as the desired gain. And if you put this together for all the different traits you're interested in as a breeder, you put them in this desired gains vector here, which I would say is usually, again, easier and more intuitive for breeders to assign than an economic value. And we will see in a bit that these economic values are not very intuitive. This became known as the desired gains index, and again, I refer you to the original paper, but Pesak and Baker showed that with using your index coefficients D, G inverse, this maximizes the correlation between the breeding objective, which are your desired gains, and the selection criterion, which is your desired gains index. And just like with the Smith-Hazel index, you can show that you can use blobs directly. Again, that comes with a couple of advantages. Now, the interesting thing in this paper is that they derived the desired gains index from the Smith-Hazel index. And they state in this paper that these desired gains are really a form of economic weights. So what does that mean? First, it means that desired gains do, in fact, have some kind of economic interpretation, and I will return to that in a bit. And secondly, it already indicates that the two concepts are somewhat similar or equivalent. Now, this equivalency did not become very obvious from their paper, I would say, but it's really, really simple to show. So recall, this is our index function here. We have our index coefficients, and we have our phenotype. The phenotypes are obviously the same in both cases. Now, how do we make them equal? Well, we just equate our index coefficients. And we know, again, from the papers, what they are, so you can just solve A for D and D for A. And this means that if you have a certain economic weight, you can derive a specific desired gains index or a desired gains vector, which would achieve exactly the same economic merit with desired gains. So this, I think, has two implications. First of all, well, again, it shows that there is an economic meaning in the desired gains. And secondly, if the Smith-Hazel index is optimal, the desired gains index also must be optimal because they can achieve the same things. However, they're optimal in their own ways because still they have different objectives, and this is why they're around. Now recall the Smith-Hazel index tries to estimate the aggregate genotype, which means it tries to maximize economic merit. The desired gains index tries to maximize genetic gain in your desired directions. Now, therefore, a straight comparison between the two indices is a little bit problematic because you're comparing apples with pears. However, this is kind of the comparison that you would often find in the literature, and we argue it doesn't make a lot of sense. So therefore, we ran a couple of simulations, which hopefully, on top of the equations, which are often not as intuitive to understand, this helps to get what is actually happening when you select based on those. What we did in these simulations, we simulated 3 traits over 8 cycles of crossing and selection, so small breeding program, assumed a couple of different genetic correlations with correlations between trait 1 and trait 2, varied different trait heritabilities, and most importantly, we did what you will find in the literature, set our economic weights and our desired gains vector equal to a ratio of 1:1:0. Now, we chose all these values to help make our point. They're not coming from any breeding program. They were chosen to really show you what could happen in a specific case. Now, what do we see here? First, the desired gains index column that you have here. I think this is pretty intuitive. The desired gains index tries to improve trait 1 and 2 equally and keep trait 3 stable, and it does this very well. You can also see that when the genetic correlation between the 2 traits decreases, total gain decreases, which is expected, but we're still making positive gain even with a negative correlation between the 2 traits. I told you there is a economic interpretation to this index, and this basically would be a breeder assumes that a product with these qualities is going to be the most successful product on the market. You're going to make the most money with that. And again, I think this is quite obvious. The Smith-Hazel index here, on the other hand, gives you very, very different patterns. And you can see that although we have equal economic weights, we're not making equal gains. And why is this happening? Well, I told you that each trade individually has the same value, trade 1 and 2, to contribute to the final product. But the index tries to maximize it. The heritability of trade 2 is much higher than the heritability in trade 1, so the index will focus on trade 2 and sacrifice a little bit in trade 1. An index weight of 0 also does not mean that we want to stabilize trade 3. It means basically trade 3 has no value for the product, and therefore do with it whatever. And what happens here is we're sacrificing trade 3 here in all 3 cases to maximize the gain that we get in trade 1 and trade 2. Now, what do we learn from that? What have we learned so far? Both are optimal for their own objective. Both can, well, mirror the respectively other index. You can find an A for D, a D for A. The second thing, which I think becomes quite clear here, is that these relative economic weights are not intuitive. They might seem intuitive because if we say trade 1 and 2 are equally valuable, again, that might feel intuitive, but the gain we get from it is not, because heritabilities and genetic correlations also come into play, and we see a pattern that I think hardly anyone here would have predicted. So what to do here? Well, the outcome, I think, again, is unpredictable unless you do the math and calculate what's going to happen. And fortunately, we can do this because we know the equivalency between the two. So I don't want to go into detail here. We don't have that time. But 2 things I want to point out. First of all, if we know our economic weights, or we think we know our economic weights, we can calculate the desired gains for the 3 trades. We can predict the expected gain in the breeding program from one generation to the next. And you can see this in the 3 columns here for the 3 simulated genetic correlations. And again, this is more or less what you would have seen in the simulations. The point I want to make here is, although you might be sure about your economic weights, these might be genetic trends in the future that you don't really envision. And therefore, if you're using economic weights, at least do the math, calculate the expected genetic gains, and make sure this is really where you want to go. The second thing with the desired gains index, again, there is a weight, an economic weight associated with it. And I just want to make again the point here, these economic weights are not intuitively correlated to genetic changes. So we see here that for trade 1, our economic weight was very high, and for the second, it was roughly 1/3 of it, although our intention was to increase both trades equally. And more, well, I don't want to say surprisingly, but more impressively, even trade 3, which we kept stable, had a higher economic weight than the second trade we wanted to increase. So my take-home message for you here is, don't use intuitive economic weights, because it can go very, very wrong, or if you want to, well, at least do the math. And this is where I very quickly want to finish with, again, something we don't have time to go into the details, but neither the desired gains index nor the Smith-Hazel index nor any other index may be optimal for you. But what you can do is you can bring both of them together knowing their connection, and something Daniel and I did here is you can move from one to the other and see how individual traits change. And if you have a certain starting point for economic weights, if you have a certain idea where you're going to go with your population, well, you can shuffle them around a little bit and figure out if this is really where you're going to go and find the optimum for you. Well, with that very short run through this, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this, because it's obviously work that we always don't do on our own. So choose your future, choose life, choose the desired gains index. Thank you.